Thank you very much for joining us, David. Again, many of you will know David Malloy, Chief Operating Officer of NetOTC. Some of the firms here, no doubt, are engaged with NetOTC in exploring their service. We've covered quite a lot of the challenges so far, and I know that NetOTC has a really quite distinct service offering around this space that I think those that are in deep conversations with you clearly understand fully. But I think broadly the market is not terribly clear on on where you're looking to play and the particular challenges that you're seeking to address. So perhaps we could kick off by asking you to outline how NetOTC views the challenges that we all face on top of the ones we've already discussed. So rather than repeating those clearly, let's look at focus on the ones that in particular you're seeking to.
Well, thank you for the question. I think the interesting thing, and just referring back to the panelists who've spoken before me, there was, they articulated very, very well the immediate challenge that the market faces. I'd say that a couple of things really jumped out in my mind in terms of unmet challenges or unarticulated challenges that I would probably add to the mix. One of them would be time. There was the timing has gotten compressed significantly, and there was an allusion, a reference to sort of the need, and you brought it up very nicely in the beginning, for information to be available as part of the pre-trade environment. And I think many of the participants were talking about it in terms of how it affects things like settlement time and the like. But I do think there's a need in the marketplace for something that provides significant pre-trade decision support. The ability to understand what the cost of your trade is before you execute the trade is going to be critical, and I think it's actually one of those little, I haven't used the word existential since college, but it is one of those existential.
About time we did.
Yeah, about time we can bring it back in, because the industry is facing, one of those crossover moments as to whether or not they're going to stay in certain businesses. I mean, if you have a 6 basis point differential between whether or not you do a trade or not do a trade, the information demand is going to be extraordinary, and the timing of that information demand is going to be even more extraordinary. I'd say the other piece is that my personal view is that we're seeing the first wave. I think the regulatory stress that's been visited on the industry, the discussions going on amongst the 30 people, the 30 banks that David described earlier in his session, is not about the economics of a particular trade or economics of a piece of business. It's not P&L motivated, it's regulatorily motivated. And so we are now in the era of regulatorily driven commerce. How long that commerce lasts, I have no idea. And I think you articulated that this disruptive behavior certainly puts us in a great spot to try to create products and services. The thing that NetOTC is focused on, though, is making the pipes fatter, or buying bigger horses to pull the bigger cart. I'm not sure is going to get us there. I think we need to start thinking about approaches that are somewhat more disruptive. I'm thinking of some of the comments that came from Clearstream as an example about repositioning Clearstream so that it can handle a wider customer base, as an example. It can change the timing of the information that flows through systems. It can recognize that we have a certain amount of nodal risk building up in the systems around the world in terms of tri-party services, and we need to have an understanding about the security environment around this, around securities. I think also the big disruption as well as we're talking about cash as collateral. I mean, we're all been driven. This is again regulatorily driven commerce. Nobody wanted cash. 85%, if I recall ISDA, 85% of the margin passing back and forth was cash because that was easy, and you could meet your timing requirements very efficiently with cash. And in fact, not to sound like the old buzzard, I mean, when we put the system together, we integrated the cash markets and the repo markets with a collateral management function. A little piece of esoteric information. That's why there's no business day description inside the credit support annex. It was deliberate. We didn't want to have the repo market disrupt the OTC market. So I think that to me represents the kind of thinking that frankly that ISDA brought to the table to help to make the market far more efficient. I think that issues that have, to answer your question, it's a little bit of a long walk here. I think disputes has It was one of the biggest issues associated with the failures in 2008. There was one major player that disputed everything that came across their desk, and of course built up huge amounts of margin calls as a result, and we saw what the follow-on from that was. But in that, we have a dispute protocol, and this is not taking any shot at ISDA, because I actually am part of the problem here. I was co-chair of ISDA's dispute management committee for a number of years when I was working in an investment bank. The dispute process hasn't worked in fair weather. I don't see it working in foul. It didn't work in 2008. I don't think the solutions that we're offering out here today I think it's going to help meet what those 30 institutions need to drag themselves across the finish line, because it's their trade-offs are what regulator am I going to respond to, what regulator am I going to appeal to, because that's the state that they're in. So many of what we're seeing right now I would call is the first wave response. Our first ideas as vendors in terms of how we're going to take some of the sting out of the requirements and how are we going to respond to the regulatory-driven commerce. So timing and dispute management, I think, are critical.
Okay, so given though that's a very interesting perspective, I think we'd all be very interested to hear what NetOTC is offering in this space. How are you positioning yourselves?
In terms of our positioning, we're working very, very closely with a number of banks and also with regulators, and they're pretty much in control of our destiny as it relates to public discussion about exactly where the product might be at any particular time. We're very pleased at the response and the engagement level that we have with the regulators, because we're looking to see if we can bring some benefits to the marketplace as it relates to the quantum of margin that is being required from the market. The interesting thing too, I think just to show you where the market is, and I'm obliquely answering your question, margin dislocation is something that is only really becoming something that the market is beginning to understand. The other piece, just to bring people's attention.
Could you outline what you mean by margin dislocation?
Margin dislocation is that when you think about what happened within the dealing community and in the end user community in 2008, many people found themselves with more margin than they actually needed opposite an insolvent counterparty. And the traditional method for getting that margin back to the insolvent counterparty is to wait for the administrator to come back and claim it back from you. Months, years later, it's still going on with Lehman Brothers. So the issue then is just at the time that a counterparty needs liquidity in order to shore up itself, you see the market actually holding back liquidity from that counterparty, and that's what we're describing as margin dislocation. If again, and when we see as a service that's needed and something that aspirationally NetOTC wants to fill, is what if you pull it all together and you're able to actually manage the release of margin instantaneously or within a specified period of time post-default, you do not have that dislocation. Again, under the rules that we have with the regulators right now, which is that the defaulting party pays. So I think that we've been looking at the quantum of margin as a bilateral issue. We're looking at it as a dislocative issue as well. One parenthetical, and it's not part of the product, but this is actually an industry sharing environment. One of the other things I heard recently in talking to a number of the banks is the unintended consequence of the margin regulations is that just very interesting. I mean, I haven't seen too many want ads for many of the regulators bringing in experts to review the margin systems that people have put in place. They haven't even hired, right? But yet, when they do, and they review a margin calculation, they could actually take a position that margin calculation process is not efficient. It's not up to the specification. In which case, the individual entity must revert to the lookup table that's been created under the auspices of the Philadelphia Accord. Well, of course, what that means isn't that institution necessarily gets punished. It does, specifically. However, every counterparty trading with that particular institution is then forced onto the rate card, which means you'd have a surge of margin being called from every counterparty that entity has. Now, these are issues that I think, if you read Basel III closely, although it was a bit frustrating, they did the BCBS IOSCO paper following the Basel III issuance. They talked about a group that will observe the impact of the margin rules and make modifications to the rules based on the impact that it has to the marketplace. I think the regulators are only beginning now to contemplate that. And as they do, I think there's a bigger role for firms like NetOTC that's basically looking, let's look at the risk and the portfolio that you have with your counterparties. Trade tickets are a nominal representation of what you have inside your book. It fluctuates every day because it's a slice of P&L, it's a slice of balance sheet, and it's a slice of your hedge. So those, to force the system backwards and say, I'll take the trade and see what it means for my book, as opposed to starting with my book and running it to the trade, maybe something that the industry should think about as being a more innovative way to handle those issues associated with reconciliation.
Okay. I would like us to get a bit specific, if we can, about NetOTC. I know there is some information you're embargoed on, which you can't talk about today, which is fine. And I think, Nick, we've got a slide. I think the audience would like to hear what you're offering in the shorter term. What is NetOTC's service? Where would it fit in?
Well, we're looking to be able to. First and foremost, it's going to be information. The idea, I find it very, very interesting. There's 254 variable terms under the credit support annex. I think that in our view, that one of the things that would be helpful for the industry would be reducing some of those terms. I think there's efforts in the market to do that. What we're proposing is that we provide a service that allows for the standardization of the trade terms, so there's far more predictability. I mean, basically, dealers look now, it took place in 2004 to 2007. They started shifting their view of their margin arrangements and stopped looking at it as a credit enhancement tool, but essentially viewed it as another leg to the trade. And once they shifted that view, those operations and processes that take place in the bowels of these organizations suddenly needed to come back and be available to the traders as a pre-trade execution model. So we think that getting that data out, allowing the dealer to be able to see what it is and the counterparty to see what it is, observe it, allows for better decision making in the first instance. And again, I think that going back to an objective that we had within the Collateral Committee years ago within ISDA was that, and this is where I actually disagree with ISDA's approach, but I think it will evolve over time. The way that the regulators, because they're driving all of our thinking, they think of the world as binary. It's either cleared or it's uncleared. Actually, I think we exist in 3 states, to be perfectly honest. We exist in the cleared state, which everybody understands. And we also have those highly structured trades that are way out there that'll never see the light of day of clearance ever, right? But the pieces that we're looking at are the pieces in the middle. They're neither, they could trend into either that first bucket I described, or they could trend and stay into the second bucket I described, but they reside in the middle. And the issue for the industry is, can you bring enough homogenization to those terms to be able to effectively manage the business with significantly reduced headcount, and at the same time be able to report out information that can be consumed by the trading entities themselves, and as well through those trading entities to the regulators who are monitoring the business activity. To this day, there is not a risk view of the dealing community available to any prudential regulator that is delivered on a consistent basis around a consistent model. So what we're attempting to do is to be able to help with the ministerial processes by essentially looking at the risks on a sensitivity based rather than on a trade base, on a portfolio base rather than on trade tickets, and be able to provide some of that information that is immediately usable by the XVA desk, as an example. That's the acronym du jour. I think it used to be CVA, DVA, KVA for capital. Then it all became XVA. And be able to have a consistent model that we've come up with, a NetOTC model, and make that available to be able to assist in being and provide a service that one would liken to an independent calculation agent.
You mean specifically a margining model?
Correct.
An IM model, yeah.
Independent calculation agent to be able to deliver that service as a node for information.
So this would be as an
rather than
alternative
risk.
to the SIM, for example.
Yeah, I don't look at SIM as being necessarily in competition. It's another approach to taking care of risk. There are some ancillary benefits associated with the model that we're proposing that, if it gets sufficient traction in the industry and sufficient traction with the regulators, it would deliver some benefits to the market as well. Is that oblique enough for you as an answer?
It's sufficiently oblique, I think.
Okay.
Is there more you'd like to say about this? In
Well,
terms of,
I mean, I think you
some of
want
the speakers talk about what data you're going to take in, what data you will provide.
Well,
out.
we're going to be currently we'll be looking at the same data elements that you provide for the SIM model. We're just running it through a different calculator.
Okay. All right. Well, we've got 5 minutes left, so a great opportunity for the audience to ask some questions. What would you like to know about NetODC's offering?
Yes, Carl.
Quick question for me. I mean, you mentioned the 3 states. If you think forward, I guess to the extent that the middle state migrates either towards cleared or non-cleared, what are you thinking kind of by a date in the future, 2018, 2020? Do you see a significant rump of non-cleared transactions still? Will FX, in your opinion, be cleared at that point?
That's a really good question. I mean, our view is that the industry can't support multiple different approaches. There is just not enough trading revenue associated with the business activity. So I would go back to some of the concepts that we were kicking around in 2007, which was collateralization, homogenization, central clearance. And so anything that can fit into that homogenization bucket, and look at it as, not being an engineer, but look at it as like an extrusion process. And if that FX trade activity and risk parameters can fit into it, and you can use it efficiently, why wouldn't you do it? And I'd say the capture would probably be in around options rather than, obviously, spot and forward.
David, I guess if you've got the sensitivities and you're able to agree that the sensitivities match and roughly the valuations match, or they agree that your valuation is the appropriate valuation for those sensitivities, are you looking at doing things like portfolio compression / simplification as a result of that to try and reduce the rump of this trade?
Well, it's interesting. It's interesting to see how many compressors there are out there now, and I mean, it's all over the market. I think that if you have that data available, it can be repurposed for a variety of reasons, or reuses rather. And I'd say that certainly, the thing that I think is vexing everybody in that regard is that what's your status as a information provider that creates an environment for a trade? And if that trade ends up as being a trade executed through under the clearing mandate, then your legal status is something that you need to be able to negotiate with the appropriate regulator. So it's an area where I think the information could be usable and could be redeployed and used for actually risk mitigation purposes. But we need to have the regulators understand what the whole concept is, between the cleared and the uncleared market, and understand that actually there's a virtuous outcome, if I can use that phrase in a capitalist context, for providing that service. But I think it's going to be a while. It's going to be a real while.
I think there's another question over there somewhere. Yep.
I was just curious, we keep talking about standardization and getting rid of multiple models. Why are we creating a new model outside of SIMS? What additional advantages can it bring to the market? Given the amount of effort and just complication.
Well, I know, and it's a tremendous amount of pain associated with it, because every small change is when you run it through the myriad of systems inside of a bank or institution, it just is a multiplier effect on the cost. A big part of I think the SIM model is rendering unto Caesar. It's bringing getting all the dealing community across the finish line in time for September 1st. That's what that represents. I think that the industry will then work with the regulatory community to modify the SIM model or make other changes as appropriate, as driven by the information that the regulators get on the impact of the SIM. We think that there might be a benefit to a more dynamic margin calculator, and we might be a little bit ahead of where the market is right now as a concept. I think our value proposition will start to be realized as we round through the end of the year and everybody gets across the finish line, has the ability to draw a breath and then make an assessment of what's the approach that actually helps them with understanding the relationship between their internal exposure at default calculation and what the payout might be under an ISDA agreement with a counterparty. But I think the market isn't ready for that right now, to be perfectly honest, because everybody's, not everybody, but people going to work today in any of the major banks who've seen 2 or 3 of their associates finding employment elsewhere and looking at the amount of work that they've got to do to drag themselves across the line for September 1st, that's the environment we're in right now.
So not to put advertising words in your mouth, but more flexible, more bespoke as the market changes.
Can I have your business card?
One final question from me, and then we'll close up the morning session. Some of what you've talked about covers functional areas that other speakers have also touched on. So it begs the question, who do you see as your competition?
Well, that's actually, it's interesting. I think that we don't necessarily see any particular, the SIM model is not competitive for the reasons I identified earlier. We don't see any particular player in the marketplace being a competitor in the sense that they're not offering the service that we're looking to offer. I do think that some of the services that we offer over the fullness of time will, going back to the analogy I used earlier, maybe we'll replace those big horses with a car. And I think that is potentially where the market goes. We can't afford the overhead take some words out of our friends from Clearstream here. We can't afford the overhead associated. We need to be able to streamline. We need to be able to homogenize some of the activity, and we have to reduce it. There isn't enough edge to support the business anymore.
Good. Well, I think on that note, we'll conclude this session. Thank you very much, David.
Well, thank you for your time. Thank you very much.